Chapter 1. The Town That Doesn't Exist. On the old highway number 46 leading to an abandoned mine, there was a small town called Grave Hollow. It was so lost among the dense forests and foggy swamps that no one had marked it on the map for a long time, but it existed, and they lived in it, Amy and Rose. The twin sisters, born on Halloween night, were inseparable since childhood. Amy was soft, kind, a little shy, always walked in the shadow of her sister. Rose was sharp, sarcastic, did not tolerate weakness, but never allowed anyone to hurt Amy. Their mother often said that they were two halves of one whole. Only this whole was strange. When Amy was 7, she saw shadows for the first time. They crawled along the walls of their house, slid between the trees outside the window, were reflected in mirrors when no one was around. She tried to tell Rose, but Rose just waved her off. You were always impressionable. Your mother told you too many stories. But the night the first girl disappeared, Rose believed. It was a fall, when the leaves on the trees turned blood red and the wind had a voice. 7-year-old Lauren Johnson went into the woods to pick mushrooms and never came back. The police said she might have fallen into a swamp or been taken by a coyote. But there were no coyotes in Grave Hollow, and the swamp had never taken anyone before. Amy knew the truth. She saw Lauren walking to the trees, and long shadows stretched behind her. Not ordinary shadows from branches or clouds, but something alive. They moved against the sun. They knew she could see them. "Are you lying again?" Rose asked when Amy told her everything. "You just—" And then she stopped talking, because the shadows were standing right behind her sister. Shadows over Elmwood. In the small town of Elmwood, lost among endless cornfields, lived a pair of sisters, Amber and Ruby. Everyone knew them. Twins with almost mirror-like faces, identical haircuts, and such blue eyes that it seemed that the autumn sky was reflected in them. They were always together, but everyone knew. Amber was kind, gentle, modest, and Ruby was sarcastic, sometimes angry, with a shadow of mockery in her voice. "They are like light and darkness," the old people said, watching the sisters wander along the deserted streets of the town, holding hands. Everything changed in the fall. First, Mr. Oldman's cat disappeared, the oldest creature in Elmwood, with shabby fur and an eye that seemed to be made of glass. Then the birds disappeared. The usual sparrows and jays that always rustled in the trees near the school suddenly disappeared. The children said that there was someone walking the fields at night, tall, thin, with glowing eyes. And then the deaths began. The first was Mrs. Debbie, the elementary school teacher. She went out for a walk on Sunday, and on Monday she was found in the fields. Her face was twisted in terror, her skin whiter than snow. When Amber saw the body, she was overcome with fear. When Ruby saw the body, she smiled. "It's time," she whispered to her sister. Amber looked at her and suddenly realized that they were no longer the same. Ruby had changed. There was something alien in her eyes. And soon Amber realized Ruby was no longer her sister. Or maybe she never was. Chapter 2. She's inside. Amber couldn't sleep. Ruby lay in the bed next to her, breathing evenly and calmly, but Amber knew it was a lie. She could feel it on her skin. Too quiet. Too unnatural. Since they found Mrs. Debbie, something had changed. In Ruby. In the house. In the city. Every night, Amber heard strange sounds. Quiet whispers, like someone was talking to the wall, although it was only a closed closet. The scraping of nails on the floor, although they had never had a cat. And then there was the smell. Rotten, cloying, as if something was rotting under the floorboards. Amber knew she should ask Ruby. After all, her sister had always been stronger, smarter. But Ruby had changed. "Are you asleep?" Amber whispered softly. Ruby didn't answer. Amber sat up in bed, trying to see her in the darkness. The dim light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows on the ceiling. Her sister lay motionless, facing the wall. "Ruby!" And then her sister spoke, but her lips didn't move. "Why are you afraid of me, Em?" The voice. It was wrong. Ruby always spoke mockingly, with a hint of irritation. But this voice was empty, as if someone was speaking through her. Amber froze. You know it's not me, right? Amber trembled. Who are you? She whispered. Ruby turned her head slowly. Her eyes glittered in the darkness, not reflecting the light, but radiating it like a wild animal's. And she smiled. I'm inside her. Amber jumped out of bed. Ruby did too, in one sharp, impossible movement. Don't run, little sister. We need to talk. Amber rushed to the door, but behind her there was an inhuman whisper that filled the entire house. Ruby was no longer Ruby, and Amber knew that if she didn't run out now, she never would. Amber, open your eyes. Remember who you are. Amber's hand reached out to her. Amber screamed, and suddenly she remembered. Chapter 3, Remember. Amber froze. Something strange happened in her head. Ruby's voice, or what was now Ruby's, echoed in her skull as if it were coming from inside her. Remember who you are. She felt her sister's fingers, cold and dead, on her wrist. She wanted to scream, to break free, but remember. Something foreign flashed in her eyes. Vague, broken images. Mrs. Debbie lying in a field. Birds flying away from the city. A figure in the dark, looking out of a mirror. And blood. So much blood. No. Amber sobbed, but her voice was no longer confident. Something inside her was waking up, too. Yes, little sister. Remember. Ruby didn't attack. She just stood there, smiling. She knew what to expect. Amber squeezed her eyes shut as the memories continued to crash like waves. Fall. Last year. She and Ruby in the woods. Whispers coming from underground. Something ancient, lurking beneath the roots of an old elm. And a promise. They promised something. They did something. And now it's back. You lied to me. Amber pulled back, gasping. Ruby shook her head slowly. No, you just didn't want to remember. Amber pressed her hands to her temples. Her head was pounding. She remembered. They didn't just find evil in the woods. They invited it. They brought it to the city. And now it was waking up. It's too late to run, Em. Ruby's voice was calm, almost gentle. It's already here. It's in us. There was movement outside the window. A tall, thin figure with eyes like Ruby's slowly stepped out of the shadows of the trees. Amber took a step back. Ruby smiled. Are you ready to remember everything? And then the window exploded. Chapter 4. It's in us. The window shattered into hundreds of pieces. A chilling wind blew into the room, lifting the curtains into the air like ghostly wings. Amber instinctively covered her face with her hands, but as the shards rained down on the floor, she saw it. The creature stood in the middle of the room. It was tall, thin, with arms too long for a human body. Its fingers moved slowly like spider legs. Its skin was dark like a shadow, but glowing, as if its fabric was woven from something unnatural. But the scariest thing were the eyes. They glowed just like rubies. Hello, little sister. Amber realized with horror that the voice was coming from inside her. The creature didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already inside her. Remember, Amber. Remember what you did. Amber staggered. No, that wasn't true. But the memories kept coming, tearing at her mind. She and Ruby, that old elm in the woods, the whispers coming from the ground, the ritual they'd done without realizing what they were doing. They thought they were playing. They thought they were just making up creepy stories, like they always did. But the words were real. The words woke him. You let me in, Amber. You let me in. Amber shuddered. The voice was coming from inside. She glanced at Ruby and knew her sister wasn't afraid anymore. Ruby was his already. The choice is yours, Em. Her sister stepped forward, holding out her hand. Are you with us or are you against us? Amber breathed heavily. She knew that if she took that hand, everything would change. Her body was already half his. And there was only one question. Would her consciousness belong to him too? Silence. The creature looked straight into her soul. And then Amber... Chapter 5. No running, no fighting. Amber took a deep breath. The darkness inside her stirred, whispering that resistance was pointless, that everything had already been decided. But she remembered something important. When they were kids, Ruby had always said, "Fear doesn't go away just by running. You have to look it in the face." Amber swallowed. She looked the creature in the face. "No." Ruby frowned. "What?" I said no. The creature tensed. The room grew cold, like an open grave. "You're mine now, Amber." It didn't speak with its lips. Its words resounded inside her. "You made a choice the night you let me in." Amber shook her head. "But I can make another choice." The creature tilted its head, as if studying her. "You don't understand. You're not human anymore. Maybe—" Amber clenched her fists. "But I'm not you either." The darkness inside her howled. Pain shot through her body, like invisible claws were digging into her spine. She screamed, but she didn't back down. Suddenly, in the midst of the horror, she remembered the last thing she remembered, that evening in the woods. Not the ritual, not the whisper, what Ruby had said before. Sisters are always together, right? And then Amber understood. It hadn't taken Ruby. Ruby had given herself willingly. It wasn't fear. It wasn't manipulation. Ruby had chosen him. "You lied to me." Amber screamed, looking into her sister's eyes. "You knew what you were doing. You wanted this." Ruby smiled. "Yes." And then Amber knew what to do. "You want me?" She looked at the thing, feeling it try and take over her consciousness completely. "Then try to take me." She broke the connection herself. Painfully, screaming in agony, the thing roared. It couldn't control her until she gave in. The window exploded again. The force hit Ruby, throwing her against the wall. The thing swirled in a vortex of shadow, howling. It was shrinking, as if losing control. Amber fought it from within. She was pushing it out. The seconds dragged on like an eternity. The darkness cracked, broke, left, and then there was silence. The creature was gone. Ruby lay motionless on the floor. Amber stood there, gasping for breath, feeling the darkness inside her slowly fade. She took a step toward her sister. "Ruby!" Ruby opened her eyes, and Amber realized she was too late. The gaze she met was no longer human. Chapter 6. "Do you remember me?" Amber looked into Ruby's eyes. They weren't her sister's anymore. There was a strange, endless darkness floating in their depths, but it was still Ruby's body. Amber took a step forward. Ruby propped herself up on her elbows, tilting her head to the side. "You won the battle, sis, but not the war." Amber knelt down in front of her. She slowly reached for Ruby's face, her fingers shaking, but she didn't look away. "Ruby," her voice was soft. "Do you remember me?" The darkness in her sister's eyes flickered. Ruby blinked. For a moment, a flicker of weakness crossed her face, like a crack in a black mirror. She hesitated. Amber didn't know why she was doing it. It wasn't a logical step, but pure instinct. She moved closer and gently touched Ruby's lips with hers. For a second, everything froze. The thing inside Ruby roared. The darkness seethed in her eyes. Her body twitched as if she were being torn apart from the inside. Amber clutched her face in her hands, not letting it slip away. "You remember me, Ruby." Her voice was not a plea, but a command. "You are my sister. You are not it." Ruby trembled. Her lips parted, as if she were trying to say something. The darkness thrashed inside her, but Amber did not let go. "Remember how we ran in the rain, how we hid in Mr. Oldman's barn, how we had nightly get-togethers with a flashlight under the covers." Ruby gasped. Amber felt her nails dig into her wrists, but she didn't flinch. "It can't take you unless you choose it." Ruby's eyes filled with tears. She opened her mouth, letting out a hoarse breath. And then the darkness tore itself away, roaring like a hurricane. Ruby's back arched, the light inside her crackling, flashing and vanishing. She went limp in Amber's arms. Only now did her sister look real, alive. Her body shook, her breathing was ragged, but when she opened her eyes, there was no darkness. Only Ruby. "You saved me," she whispered. Amber smiled through her tears. Sisters are always together, right? Ruby hugged her, and outside, behind the windows, something was whispering in the wind. It was gone, but not forever. Chapter 7. It's not gone. Ruby was shaking in Amber's arms, her breathing ragged. But she was here. Real. Amber held her sister close, feeling their hearts beat in unison. But something was wrong. It was too quiet outside. No wind, no whispers. Not even the streetlights outside were shining anymore. The darkness, it was getting thicker. Ruby shuddered. We're not alone. Amber looked up and saw eyes. Hundreds of eyes, glowing in the darkness outside the window. They were watching. It's... Amber swallowed. It's not gone. It's just waiting. Ruby turned slowly, squeezing her hand. The darkness was moving outside the window. And then they heard a knock. Quiet. Steady. Knock. 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 Ruby's voice broke. It wants to come in. Amber gritted her teeth. Not this time. The knocking grew louder. Knock. 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 It wasn't going to back down. It was angry. It wanted them both. We need to get out of here. Amber screamed, dragging Ruby toward the door. But as they ran out into the hallway, the lights flickered and the doors began to disappear. The walls were disappearing. The house was disappearing. They were trapped. The darkness stirred, enveloping them like a living thing. And then it spoke. You thought you won? The voice came from all sides. I'm not leaving. I'll never leave. I'm inside you. Amber clenched her fists. Ruby looked at her. We can fight, right? Amber nodded. Always. Darkness fell upon them. They screamed, and the world disappeared. Chapter 8, New Reality. When Amber opened her eyes, the first thing she noticed was silence. There was no whispering, no thunder. The darkness seemed to evaporate, leaving only gloom behind. She jumped up, looking around. They were no longer in the house. They were in another place. It was not a city, not a forest, not any familiar place. It was a place where neither time nor space existed. The space was empty, white as a clean sheet, but in its center stood shadows, twisted, misshapen shapes that had no contours, no precise outlines. Ruby was nearby. She was sitting on the ground, her eyes closed. She did not move. Amber walked up to her, touching her shoulder. Ruby? Sister slowly raised her head, her eyes empty. We didn't win, Her voice was weak, almost lifeless. We didn't get out. We're not in our world. We're in his. Amber froze. Him. The darkness? The creature? Or whoever was behind all of this. Do you remember what happened when we did that ritual? Ruby looked at her. Do you remember what we summoned? Amber flinched, but her consciousness was still lost in the darkness. She remembered, but she couldn't find the words. Yes, we opened the door. We called him. Ruby continued, as if she knew Amber couldn't answer. But we don't really understand what it was. We don't understand what it did to us. Amber closed her eyes. They stood in a timeless space where there was no night and no day. Nothing but silence and shadow. And then, like the soft crunch of ice under her fingernails, she heard it again. A voice, a whisper, a shadow that waited. You thought you could break away from me, but now you are with me forever. Amber turned. He was close, and he knew how to make them afraid. This was only the beginning. Chapter 9, Confessions in the Shadows. Amber looked at Ruby. She was so close, and everything in her body and mind was screaming for her to say something important, something that would free her from this endless pressure. I'm sorry, Ruby. Her voice was barely audible, but there was desperation in it. I don't know what happened to me. You're my sister, and I shouldn't have done this. Ruby looked at her with a soft expression on her face, almost as if it was natural, as if she already knew what was coming. Her voice was quiet but warm. You don't have to apologize. Amber felt her heart beat faster. She glanced around nervously, but the space around them was empty and lifeless, giving her no shelter. But I kissed you. It was wrong. It was not right. Her words trailed off, and she seemed to still be trying to figure out what she was really feeling. Ruby chuckled softly, a glimmer of something in her eyes that Amber couldn't quite place. "If you want to kiss me, I'm fine with that." Her answer was so unexpected that Amber froze for a moment. It wasn't angry or judgmental, but rather just a calm admission. Her sister understood. Ruby raised her hand, touching Amber's cheek. "You can't get rid of your feelings. They won't go away just because you try to suppress them." Her fingers slid over her skin, as if seeking comfort rather than judgment. Amber felt her breath hitch. Something was pulling her toward Ruby, in a way relieving her of her own guilt, but also frightening her at the same time. "Aren't you afraid?" she asked, her voice shaking. "What should I be afraid of? You're my sister." Ruby answered calmly, but something mysterious gleamed in her eyes. Amber couldn't hold back any longer. She leaned forward, unable to fight the desire. It was like an irresistible attraction, like a need to feel what was between them. And in that moment, they were close again. Their breaths mingled, and Amber kissed Ruby again. But this time, it wasn't guilt or fear. It was a moment in which they both, without words, understood that something had changed. Something about their relationship was different. Perhaps it was complicated and even incomprehensible, but all this happened in this eerie place where there were no rules and boundaries. Amber pulled away, meeting Ruby's gaze. Their lips trembled slightly, but there was some kind of peace in it, a new world. "What are we going to do now?" Amber asked, her voice finally steadying. Ruby smiled. It wasn't a normal smile, but a smile full of understanding. "We'll fight. You don't want to be what they're trying to make us, do you?" Amber nodded, feeling her heart fill with determination. They were together now, and nothing could separate them. Chapter 10, Dark Borders. The darkness around them began to thicken. It felt thicker, as if space itself was trying to close them in. Amber squeezed Ruby's hand tightly, feeling the cold that was creeping into their souls. "What happens next?" Her voice was quiet but determined. She knew she couldn't stay in this world forever. This place was unforgiving of weakness, and something in it was pulling them down to the very bottom. Ruby looked at her, her eyes unusually clear. "We can't leave here, Em. Do you understand that?" Her eyes held no fear, only calm, as if she had accepted the inevitable. "But I won't let him take us. We won't be his toys." Amber nodded, her hand feeling Ruby's warmth in response, as if their connection was the only thing that could protect them in this empty space. Suddenly, the darkness around them began to move. The walls began to close in, and as if by magic, they found themselves in a new reality. It was a place like a dark room, filled with shuddering shadows that seemed to be looking at them with eyes. Amber took a deep breath and felt a cold hand of doubt squeeze her heart. She turned to Ruby. "What is it?" Her voice was full of worry. "He came." Ruby tilted her head to the side. "He was with us the whole time. We just didn't realize it." At that moment, shadows began to emerge on the wall, penetrating the space and creating a chill that seemed to permeate the entire body. Amber saw a face in the center of the shadow. It was dark and indefinable, but she knew it was him. "You can't leave." The voice came from outside and inside, like an echo that made the walls shake. Amber clenched her fists, her nerves tensing, but she didn't look away. "We're not leaving. We'll win if we have to." The shadows stirred again. It wasn't just movement. It was awareness. It was as if the shadow itself was listening to her words, crawling deeper into their minds. "Then I'll take your mind, like I took everything else. You can't defeat me anyway." Amber felt her thoughts begin to jumble. Vague images appear around her. Old fears, memories, thoughts she thought long forgotten. All of it was consuming her. But Ruby wasn't afraid. She took a step forward. "You won't take us." Her voice was firm. "We'll fight. We're sisters, and nothing will separate us." The shadow froze, as if it suddenly realized something. In an instant, it began to dissolve, slowly losing its shape. "You think you'll win? I am eternity." The voice was barely audible, a dying whisper. Amber took Ruby's hand tightly, not letting go, and felt something new fill her. It wasn't power, it wasn't magic. It was something more important. It was their choice. We won't give up. We chose to be together. And that bond is stronger than your shadow. The shadow disappeared, but Amber knew that this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning of their fight. Come on, we'll find a way out. Ruby nodded, and they walked down the dark hallway, ready to face whatever else was waiting for them in this world. Their journey was just beginning.